Sometimes history doesn't begin with an explosion. Sometimes it begins with a sentence that cuts through the air like a cold blade. The silence is over. Those were the words coming out of Geneva, steady, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. And for millions of people across East Africa, they landed like a thunderclap. On the morning of October 11, 2025, the United Nations broke its silence on what may be one of the darkest election episodes the African continent has seen in recent memory. A continent that has endured coups, contested elections, and turbulent transfers of power suddenly found itself staring at something far more disturbing: a government accused of hiding its own dead. Just 12 days earlier, Tanzania had announced that President Samia Suluhu Hassan had secured 97% of the national vote, an impossible number in any functioning democracy. Opposition candidates had been barred, journalists silenced, rallies forbidden. And when the results were declared, the streets did not erupt in celebration. They erupted in fear, anger, and disbelief. For older Americans watching from afar, this moment may feel eerily familiar: echoes of elections in places where truth was replaced with intimidation, where the vote was not a choice, but a performance. The United Nations says reports coming out of Tanzania are harrowing. Bodies quietly removed by security forces, families running from one hospital to the next, one police station after another searching for loved ones who vanished after Election Day, hundreds killed, many more detained, some children. And now the world is finally paying attention. But inside Tanzania, the silence remains. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of fear. So here is the question we must all confront, no matter where we live. What happens to a nation when the truth itself becomes a crime? And how long can the world look away before the cost becomes irreversible? If you believe stories like these matter, if you believe the truth must be spoken even when others remain silent, please take a moment to share this video. And if you are someone who still believes in accountability, dignity, and justice, I invite you to subscribe. Your voice helps ensure that silence never wins. The story of Tanzania's 2025 election does not begin with the United Nations in Geneva. It begins weeks earlier on the dusty streets of Dar es Salaam, Arusha, Mwanza, and dozens of smaller towns where ordinary Tanzanians already sensed that something was going terribly wrong. From the start, the October 29th general election carried the scent of a political outcome already decided. Opposition leaders were pushed aside, many of them disqualified on technicalities that appeared designed, not accidental. Journalists who tried to cover the growing tension reported harassment, surveillance, or sudden legal issues. Rallies of opposition supporters, normally loud, colorful, and vibrant, were quietly banned under the justification of security concerns. For many citizens, the campaign felt less like a national conversation and more like a performance stage to produce a single result. And that result came swiftly: 97% of the vote for President Samia Suluhu Hassan. A number so absolute, it stopped people in their tracks. In a democracy, 97% is not a victory, it is a warning. And Tanzanians reacted accordingly. Within hours of the announcement, people poured into the streets not to cheer, but to protest. Women with headscarves waved handwritten signs. Young men, many still in their school uniforms, marched with their fists in the air. Elderly citizens stood on their doorsteps and whispered, "This cannot be real." The disbelief was universal. The anger was immediate. But if the protests came quickly, the response came even faster. Witnesses across several regions reported seeing convoys of security forces move into neighborhoods before sundown. Roadblocks appeared at key intersections. Internet access, never fully reliable, became noticeably slower. By nightfall, the crackdowns had begun. What happened next would eventually reach Geneva, but in those early hours it was known only to the people living it. Reports gathered later by the UN Human Rights Office describe hundreds of Tanzanians being killed in the span of a few days. The number of missing rose even faster. Mothers ran from one police station to another, only to be told, "Your son is not here." Fathers were instructed to check hospitals, even morgues. But even in morgues, families found empty shelves and no records, because according to eyewitness accounts, bodies were being removed by security forces and taken to undisclosed locations. This single detail, the quiet nighttime removal of the dead, became the most chilling symbol of the crisis. It implied not just violence, but a deliberate attempt to erase evidence of that violence. The United Nations would later describe this pattern in one devastating sentence: These accounts are harrowing, and yet the arrests continued. More than 150 people were detained after Election Day, many of them teenagers. Some were charged with the most severe accusation available under Tanzanian law, treason, a crime that in many countries carries the possibility of capital punishment. Others were simply taken and never heard from again. Among those detained was opposition leader Tundu Lissu, a man who had survived assassination attempts in previous years and was now once again incarcerated, this time under the shadow of a disputed election. As the streets of Tanzania grew quieter, it wasn't because the unrest had ended. It was because people were terrified. Fear replaced anger. Whispering replaced marching. Parents kept their children indoors. Markets closed early. Schools operated under a heavy cloud of uncertainty. In some neighborhoods, the sound of boots on pavement became more common than the sound of children playing. And far away in Geneva, the information began to converge: testimonies, phone recordings, eyewitness accounts, leaked footage, and desperate messages from Tanzanians who didn't know where else to turn. All of it pointing to the same conclusion: this was not just an election gone wrong. It was a humanitarian crisis unfolding in silence. It was only a matter of time before the United Nations broke that silence. The turning point came on October 11, 2025. From the cold, glass-fronted headquarters in Geneva, the world finally heard what Tanzanians had been whispering in fear for nearly 2 weeks. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk, a man known for choosing his words with surgical precision, stepped forward and delivered the statement that would echo across continents. The silence is over. And then these accounts are harrowing. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, not because the violence was new, but because someone with global authority had finally said out loud what everyone else had avoided. The crescendo of the Tanzanian crisis had reached the international stage. Turk detailed what the UN had gathered: protesters and civilians killed in the streets, bodies removed at night by security forces, families searching hospitals and police stations in agony, more than 150 people detained since Election Day, teenagers and even minors held on charges as extreme as treason, opposition figures, including Tundu Lissu, still behind bars. But it was the detail about the removal of bodies that pushed the global reaction into a higher gear. In crises, violence is not unusual. But the attempt to erase the evidence of that violence, that is what chilled diplomats, journalists, analysts, and ordinary East Africans to the bone. In Geneva, Turk stopped short of using the most explosive terms, but everyone listening understood the implication. This was not just repression. It was a deliberate concealment of the consequences of that repression. And yet, as the UN raised its voice, something strange happened across Africa. Most governments said nothing. The African Union, often quick to comment on coups or contested elections, remained silent. No emergency session, no press release, no condemnation. It was as if an entire institution had collectively held its breath. Neighboring countries, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, also avoided public comment. Diplomats described the situation as sensitive. Others privately admitted what many suspected: nobody wanted to be accused of interfering in Tanzania's internal matters, even as reports of killings and disappearances grew impossible to ignore. Ironically, it was Kenya's journalists, not its politicians, who broke the regional silence. In a televised discussion, a Kenyan presenter asked a blunt question that ricocheted across East Africa: 97%. Isn't that like North Korea? His guest, a Kenyan official, fumbled for a diplomatic answer, but the disbelief in his voice said everything. And then the reaction on social media erupted. Tanzanian exiles began sharing stories of missing relatives. Kenyans started trending the hashtag #Tanzania Massacre. Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, and even Somali users joined in demanding accountability. Graphic descriptions, not always confirmed, but undeniably desperate, spread across WhatsApp groups and Facebook pages. For many East Africans, the crisis in Tanzania awakened old fears: the fear of military repression, the fear of governments turning against their own people, the fear of elections manipulated until they became meaningless. But the strongest reaction didn't come from officials or institutions. It came from ordinary East Africans looking at Tanzania and asking themselves, could this happen here in Kenya, where citizens had recently faced their own waves of police crackdowns? That question hit particularly hard. Commentators noted that the pattern: restricting opposition, intimidating journalists, using security forces to control dissent, was not limited to Tanzania. It was becoming a troubling regional trend. Meanwhile, inside Tanzania, the streets grew quieter. But it was not the quiet of resolution. It was the quiet of watching and waiting to see whether the world would act or look away. Volker Turk's statement ended with demands independent, transparent investigations, release of all detained protesters, immediate access to legal counsel, and the return of bodies to families for proper burials. His final words were stern, almost solemn. Due process is not optional. It was the most forceful international condemnation Tanzania had faced in years. But whether it would change anything, whether it would protect even a single family searching for a missing son or daughter, remained painfully uncertain. The crisis had reached its emotional and political peak. The world was finally watching. But Tanzania's government had not yet answered. When the dust of the protests finally settled, what remained in Tanzania was not peace, but a deep, aching wound that stretched from crowded city streets to the quietest rural villages. The consequences of the post-election violence were not abstract. They were written on the faces of families who stood outside hospital doors, the sleepless eyes of children who watched soldiers march through their neighborhoods, and the heavy silence that fell over communities where too many young men had suddenly vanished. For ordinary Tanzanians, the immediate civil consequence was simple, and devastating fear became a daily companion. Parents no longer allowed their children to walk alone. Market traders whispered instead of speaking openly. Teachers told students not to discuss politics, even in private. In many places, the familiar rhythm of everyday life music at the kiosks, chatter at bus stops, evening prayers spoken freely was replaced by an anxious quiet. But beneath that quiet, deeper fractures were forming. Families of the missing found themselves in a kind of suspended grief. Without bodies, there could be no funerals. Without funerals, there could be no closure. In African culture, just like in many American families, burying loved ones is sacred. It is how pain is carried, how dignity is restored, how life moves forward. But for hundreds of Tanzanian families, the chance to mourn was taken away. Mothers held on to a desperate hope that missing might still mean alive. Others knew the truth but were denied the simple right to say goodbye. These civilian wounds soon intertwined with political consequences. Inside the ruling establishment, cracks began to appear, quiet disagreements, whispered doubts, and private fears about international backlash. Some officials worried that ignoring the UN's demands could bring diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, or even sanctions. Others insisted the government must maintain a unified front no matter the cost. But the deeper political consequence was something no government can easily control: the loss of public trust. For many Tanzanians, the events after the election confirmed what they had long suspected, that the system designed to protect their rights was now being used to silence them. Courts were perceived as extensions of political power. The police were seen less as guardians and more as enforcers. Even local leaders, who usually played a stabilizing role in communities, found themselves unable or unwilling to intervene. Regionally, the crisis sent ripple effects through East Africa. Kenya, already on edge due to its own protests and political tensions, viewed Tanzania as a troubling mirror image of what unchecked state power can become. In Uganda and Rwanda, opposition groups pointed to Tanzania as a warning, a sign of how fragile democratic institutions could be if pushed too far. And then there was the long-term psychological consequence, one that cannot be measured in numbers or reports. A generation of Tanzanian youth witnessed their first major national election end in violent censorship and fear. Experiences like that do not disappear. They shape how young citizens view their government, their country, and their future. They shape whether they believe political participation is meaningful or dangerous. Some analysts noted that if the government continued to resist transparency, the crisis could deepen into something more enduring: greater polarization, increasing radicalization among frustrated youth, and long-term instability tied to unresolved trauma. By the time the UN issued its strongest statement, one truth had become clear: Tanzania's crisis was no longer just about an election. It was about what happens to a nation when fear erodes trust, when justice becomes selective, and when the voices of ordinary people are treated as threats instead of foundations. The civil and political consequences were already unfolding. The question now was whether the government would choose reconciliation or push the nation even deeper into uncertainty. From outside Africa, the world looked at Tanzania's election crisis through a very different lens, one shaped by strategic interests, concerns about stability, and the growing global conversation about democracy in the 21st century. And in many ways, the reaction or lack of reaction revealed as much about the international community as it did about Tanzania itself. For the United States, Tanzania is not just another country on the map. It is a strategic partner in East Africa, sitting along critical trade routes and serving as a buffer in a region historically vulnerable to political unrest and extremist activity. Washington understands that instability in one East African nation rarely stops at its borders. It spills over into Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and sometimes even further. When the United Nations released its statement, American diplomats responded carefully. Washington has always walked a tightrope between promoting democratic values and protecting regional partnerships. Privately, U.S. analysts expressed alarm at the severity of the allegations: killings, disappearances, minors, detained bodies moved secretly in the night. These were not the typical signs of a contested election. They were the signs of a potentially deeper collapse in governance. Yet, the Biden administration also recognized the diplomatic dilemma. Condemning too loudly could push Tanzania's government toward alternative global partners, nations less concerned with human rights and more interested in expanding influence on the continent. Remaining silent, however, risked signaling that America was willing to overlook violence in favor of political convenience. For older Americans watching the coverage, this balancing act may have felt reminiscent of the Cold War era, when global powers frequently chose strategic alliances over democratic principles. Across the Atlantic, the European Union watched the crisis with increasing unease. Brussels has long invested in East African stability through development programs, election support missions, and humanitarian projects. A disputed election followed by a violent crackdown threatened to undermine years of diplomatic and economic engagement. Although the EU did not immediately issue a full condemnation, European analysts warned that continued abuses could affect trade agreements, visa cooperation, and development funding. In East Africa, the reaction was more complicated. Government leaders avoided public comment, but opposition parties, activists, and civil society organizations across the region viewed the UN's announcement as validation of their concerns about shrinking democratic space. Kenya, struggling with its own internal tensions, took special interest in the UN's findings. Commentators on Kenyan television warned that what happened in Tanzania was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader regional trend of governments tightening their grip on power and treating dissent as criminal. At the global level, the crisis also fit into a larger debate. What happens when elections become rituals instead of choices? What happens when authoritarian tendencies evolve within systems that still call themselves democracies? This is where comparisons naturally emerged. Analysts pointed out that while East Africa is struggling with questions of legitimacy and repression, West Africa is witnessing a different movement, one centered on sovereignty, community legitimacy, and grassroots participation. Examples from countries like Burkina Faso under leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré have sparked conversations worldwide about whether Africa is entering a new political era, one where traditional Western-style electoral models may no longer be the only measure of democratic expression. For global audiences, especially Americans, the crisis in Tanzania served as a reminder that democracy is fragile everywhere. It does not vanish overnight. It fades in small steps: the silencing of journalists, the intimidation of opponents, the manipulation of election systems, and finally, the violence used to enforce silence. And as the world watched Tanzania's turmoil unfold, one question lingered over every capital from Washington to Brussels to Nairobi. Would this crisis become a turning point that forces the world to rethink how it engages with African democracies, or would it become another tragedy allowed to fade quietly from the headlines? In the end, the story of Tanzania's 2025 election crisis is not only about ballots or numbers or even political power. It is about the lives caught in the crossfire, the mothers still waiting for news of their children, the families denied the dignity of burial, the young people whose only crime was believing that their voices could make a difference. These are the human threads that will define how history remembers this moment. When the United Nations broke its silence, it did more than issue a statement. It forced the world to look directly at a truth many were willing to ignore: that a nation can appear calm on the outside while bleeding quietly from within. And for those who have watched Africa for decades, Americans, Europeans, Africans in the diaspora, this story serves as a painful reminder that democracy is most vulnerable when it seems most secure. But there is another deeper lesson here. A nation is not judged by how it handles victory. It is judged by how it confronts its own failures. Tanzania now stands at a crossroads. It can choose accountability, opening the door to independent investigations, releasing detainees, restoring trust, returning dignity to grieving families. Or it can choose silence, risking further isolation, deeper instability, and a generation forever marked by trauma and mistrust. One path leads toward healing. The other leads toward a slow, quiet corrosion of the nation's soul. And what about the rest of the world? For global watchers, especially older Americans who have seen many chapters of history come and go, the events in Tanzania raise broader questions about the direction of democracy, human rights, and justice across the African continent. East Africa faces one of its most defining tests in years. And elsewhere on the continent, particularly in West Africa, new political models are emerging rooted in sovereignty, community accountability, and national pride. Many point to places like Burkina Faso and to leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré as symbols of a different kind of African political awakening. Whether one agrees with these new models or not, one thing is undeniable. Africa News Today is no longer shaped solely by foreign observers. It is increasingly shaped by Africans themselves, leaders, youth movements, communities rising to demand dignity and truth. And that shift may ultimately determine how crises like Tanzania's are addressed, prevented, or repeated. So now the question becomes yours. Should the world simply watch, or should it demand better from Tanzania, from its leaders, and from every nation that calls itself a democracy? Your voice matters here. If you believe the United Nations has taken an important first step, share this video. If you believe African lives deserve the full protection of international law, speak up. And if you believe truth should never be buried, no matter how hard some try to hide it, then subscribe and stand with us, because silence may protect power, but only truth protects people.